Thank you for this opportunity, and I thank God for this opportunity. Okay, as you all know, we will be studying from Mark chapter 15, verse 1 to 20. So, without much delay, I would like to go to the passage. You might all have noticed, have uh, read this passage before coming here. However, I would encourage all of us to learn this together. I'm using this hardcover Bible. I'm a bit old school in this thing. So, yeah, I'll be using hardcover Bible and pencil also when we are doing it together. So, Mark chapter 15, verse 1 to 20. We see that all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, narrates the passion narrative of Jesus, the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus. However, the briefest of all this account is Mark's account. Certain things that we see in Matthew. In Matthew, we see that Pilate's wife dream is narrated by Matthew, and Pilate washing his hand is also narrated by Matthew. But we don't see that in Mark. And in Luke, we see the Jesus's trial before Antipas, and that is also absent in Mark's account. And in John, we see a beautiful discourse that Jesus presents before Pilate. That is also absent in Mark. So why are these things absent? The thing is, Mark presents Jesus as the suffering servant king, right? So this brevity in this account aids to Mark's theme of presenting, of identifying Jesus as the suffering servant king. So in this passage, the overall theme of Mark itself is Mark is presenting Jesus as the suffering servant king. And this particular passage deals a lot to let us know the character, the identity of Jesus as the suffering king. One passage in Old Testament that resonates so much with this is Isaiah's account of the suffering king. We'll simultaneously look at all these things while we are going through this session. So, if you have Bible, then you can just go verses chapter 15, verse 1 to 15, 1 to 20 are the things that we are looking. But then in 1 to 50, it's a textual unit, it's a pericope. And how do we identify this textual unit? In verse 1, part B, we see that the chief priest handed Jesus over to Pilate, right? So this handed him over is seen there. And in verse 15b, what we see is Pilate handing Jesus over to be crucified. So the thing that comes between is bracketed between this phrase, handing Jesus over or handing him over. Okay. And however, we also see that 16 to 20, the end of this, led Jesus out to be crucified. 15 part B ends with handing him over to be crucified. And verse 16 part B also ends with then they let him out to be crucified. I'm just saying this so that when we read the Bible, we will not finish reading few verses without completing the intended purpose of that thing. So it's always necessary. Like if we don't have time, it's better not to read than reading two verses and then stopping it. Because if I just read 1 and 2, then it's purposeless. The intended purpose of the author or how Jesus wants us to understand it will not be fulfilled. So it's always necessary, at least when we read and study, we take a particular textual unit or a particular copy and read and study like that. As we know that the immediate literary context of this is the passion narrative, the suffering and the crucifixion of Jesus. It starts from Mark 14 verse 1 to 15:47, where Jesus' death and burial is there. So we are looking at Mark 1 to 20, but then Mark 1 to 15. I would title this as the king sentenced to die. So most of the time, I would try to say Jesus as the king and Pilate as the governor. Okay, so the king sentenced to die. So in Mark 1:15:1, what we read here is very early in the morning, the chief priests and the elders and teachers, the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, the entire Sanhedrin, bound Jesus and led him to the Pilate's palace, Pilate's residence. That is actually Herodian's palace, because Pilate had come here because it is of Passover time. Otherwise, Pilate wouldn't have been here. And whenever Pilate comes to Jerusalem, he stays in the old palace of Herod, and that is the historian says that that is something very magnificent. So Pilate stays there, and in from verse 1b to 5, verse 5, we see the governor interrogating the king, the king's trial before the governor. And in verse 2, we see that the governor is questioning the king, and we also see the reply of the king. And in verse 3, we see the chief priest accusing the king. And after that, we see Jesus' silence. And we also see that the silence of Jesus is marveling Pilate. So I'll go in detail to all these things. And from verse 6 to 11, we see the demand of the crowd to deliver the criminal. Okay. And from 12 to 14, it is the demand of the crowd to crucify the king. And in verse 15, we see the governor decree the king's execution or the crucifixion. And from 16 to 20, we see the soldiers mock the king. Okay, so one thing that we used to follow when we read the Bible is like we need to picturize the events. Like if we just read it and just finish it off, then we would not be able to understand it well. But then if we just internalize what is written in our head, like using our imagination, and I'll remind you again, use the imagination that is written in the Bible and not anything outside of it. Okay, like not the weirdest of the imagination that we can perceive, but then whatever is written, it could be always good to internalize or imagine the thing. So to help us to imagine the entire thing of Jesus' trial, I have divided it into certain scenes. The first scene, as previous week Albi said, it was the interrogation before the Jewish leaders. And from there, Jesus was being bounded and led and handed him over to the Roman trial. So what came to my mind is, whenever there is a crime scene, whenever there is a criminal, the police force will come and bind the person, push the person, and drag the person into the jeep, right? I've seen that a lot of times. See, these people, the person, the accused criminal would be willing to walk directly to the jeep and would be in the jeep. But then there would be a lot of drama going on, binding the person, pushing the person. 3 or 4 police forces will be there, dragging one person and to the jeep or something like that. So kind of like a scene is happening here as well. In verse 1, it says they bound Jesus, led him, and handed him over to Pilate like a criminal. And then what we see is the whole conversation. We cannot say, like, Jesus is almost silent in the trial. The thing that happens between Jesus and Pilate, Pilate's question and Jesus' answer, the chief priest accusation, all those things. And then we see that Pilate is going out and consulting with the crowd. What shall I do with what you call the King of Jews? However, we have we have come this far, and we know the sandwich method that Mark is using. Here we see in this particular scene, inside the scene there is a sandwich. The narrator Mark says that the Pilate had gone out and asked crowd, "What shall I do with this man whom you call as Jesus?" However, in between, in verse 11, between verse 9 and 14, there is a sequence. In verse 11, this chief priest is having a private conversation with the crowd, and he is stirring up the crowd to plot against Jesus. Their chief priest is asking the crowd to crucify Jesus. Okay? So that kind of internal sandwich is there. And from in verse 15, we see that Pilate make an official decree to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. And from 16 to 20, we see a whole episode of Roman soldiers leading Jesus into the palace and out of the palace. And we go through it in details. Okay, so verse 1 to 5. So we see a structure here. The first one is the act of the chief priest. In verse 1, we see the chief priest is acting. Okay, there. And in verse 3, we also see chief priest accused Jesus. And in verse 2, we see Pilate asked Jesus. What did Pilate ask Jesus? Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And in verse 4, we again see Pilate asked Jesus. And in verse 2b, we see Jesus' reply. What is Jesus' reply? Jesus is saying, "You have said so." And in verse 5, we again see that Jesus made no reply. Okay, so this is the structure. I'll just close this. So I was just giving a brief intro to this thing. Yeah, and then we'll just. So in verse 1, we see that it was early in the morning that Jesus was being taken and taken to the palace, to the in front of Pilate to be tried. So before that, we see the night trial. The Jewish leaders is having an interrogation with Jesus at the night. That is actually an illegal act. It is very much illegal to try a criminal in the night, but then the Jewish leaders are doing that. And early in the morning, they are taking Jesus to Pilate's place. And after that, we see the chart. We in verse 2, Pilate is asking, "Are you the king of Jews?" But then we don't know the context by which Pilate is making this assumption. Are you the king of Jews? To know that, we need to go back to Luke chapter 23, verse 2. The charges against Jesus. The charges that are against Jesus is that this man subverts our nation. That is one charge. And this man opposes paying tax to Caesar. And this man claims to be Christ, the king. So all these charges subvert our nation. What does that charge mean? That this man is against Roman government. This man is against the king. And paying tax to Caesar, that is a direct charge of Jesus' rebellion against Caesar. And this man claims to be king. We know that in Roman Empire, the sovereign, the king, is only the emperor. So all these three trials are political, right? And see, if the trial was like this man claims to be God, then probably Pilate would be like, okay, what's the big deal with it? See, there are lots and lots of God sons, God men, sons of God in our mythology, in our culture. So if this man wants to be a god, then let him fix into our cupboard. Like in Indian context also, if we just say that Jesus is God to an Indian, then the person would be like, okay, what's the big deal? I accept that Jesus is God. And in that cupboard or in the place where they place all the images of God, then they would just place Jesus also as one among the millions of gods. So so this is not a big charge. Like Jesus claiming to be God is not a big charge in the Roman trial scene, because there are lots of gods there. But then there is only one king, and that king is considered as the Lord. Yeah. So we know that Jesus claiming to be God is not a big deal, but then Jesus claiming to be king is really a big deal, because that is a high treason, and that is an offense that is worthy of capital punishment, that is worthy of crucifixion. So the charges against Jesus is like that. Okay. Yeah, sorry about the disturbance earlier. And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, "You have said so." So Jesus is throwing the ball back to Pilate's court. So if Jesus had said, "Yes, I am the king," then all of a sudden the execution, like there is no need for a trial, ongoing trial. But then the thing is, the ball is in Pilate's court. You have said so. Okay, so Pilate has the authority to decide. decide to make a decision here. And the chief priest is coming and accusing Jesus again and again. And Pilate asks, like, it is a chance, it's an opportunity for you to claim, you to present your case. If you are the king, then if you are not the king, then tell us that I have the authority to set you free or to crucify you. So Pilate is asking Jesus to prove his case, to speak for himself, okay, to use his right. But then Jesus, what did Jesus do here is Jesus just remains silent. So in face of of all these oppositions and hatred and abuse and cruelty, what Jesus do is to remain silent. And we certainly know that Jesus' silence is not because Jesus don't have an appropriate word to speak, or Jesus is just, we know, right? Sometimes we just get blackout when there is a trouble situation. It is not like Jesus got blackout and he was silent. No, it was not a defeat on Jesus' part, but it was a willing submission to his Father, a surrender to God's sovereignty that Jesus remained silent. A passage from Old Testament that really echoes with this is Isaiah's account of in Isaiah 53 verses 7. It says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was like a lamb to be slaughtered, as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." And moving forward, so this is from verse 1 to 5. I'll just share my screen. Okay, from 6 to 15, we see the release of a prisoner here. And we see the demand of the crowd. Then we see Jesus as a king of Jew and the act of the chief priest. So in verse 6, what we see is it's a custom to release a criminal that is supposed to be executed. And there is a man called Barabbas in the prison. And then the crowd is asking, Pilate is asking the crowd, what shall he do? And then in verse 11, we see the chief priest is playing something in the background, and crowd is requesting to execute the king of the Jews. And then the king of the Jews is condemned to die. And then verse 15, we see that Pilate is releasing this prisoner. So I hope you got this structure well. So this A, B, C, D, and we see D, C, B, A here. Okay, I'll just stop. Yeah. So a new character is introduced here. Who is this new character being introduced? This person is called Barabbas. Barabbas is a prisoner. He's someone who revolted against the Roman government. He's a political criminal. Okay. But then the irony in this part is his name, Barabbas. Barabbas means the son of the father. Bar-Abba. Okay, the son of the father. So he is a political rebel, a criminal, and a murderer. And this person is there. Jesus is also there. The choice is between these two. And the crowd has to decide whom should be crucified and whom should be set free. So we know who Jesus is, right? Who is Jesus? John presents Jesus. The entire Gospel of John presents Jesus as the Father's Son. Robert Kaiser, a Johannine scholar, says the entire Gospel of John can be concised in these two terms, Jesus as the Father's Son. So we see Jesus as a son of the Father, and we see Barabbas as a son of the Father. And who is Barabbas? You know, right? A criminal. And who is Jesus? You know, right? An obedient son of the Father, obedient Father's son. So the crowd has a choice now. Whom should be crucified? And what the crowd did was they set the criminal free, and then they asked to crucify the righteous one, the obedient son of the Father. The innocent son of the Father is condemned to death. In Romans 5:8, we say, while we were all sinners, Christ died for us. who was the sinner here actually? The sinner was Barabbas, right? But then who was the righteous one here? The righteous one was Jesus, the Father's Son. However, here we see this Father's Son is replacing Barabbas, and he's dying not just instead of Barabbas, but instead of every one of us. So we see the irony here, like the righteous one is being condemned to death, and the criminal is set free. And the crowd plays a major role in Mark's gospel. We have seen that all throughout these months. And this crowd is really brainless. The crowd is like very flickering. If someone says this, they'll think, oh, that is right. And if some other person says this, then they're very much slandering nature. In some of you might have read this the speech by Mark Antony when Julius Caesar died. When Julius Caesar died, Mark Antony is making a speech. So the crowd was like, Brutus. Brutus is a nobleman. They're saying Brutus is a nobleman. And then Mark Antony is saying, oh, judgment, thou hast fled the brutish beast. Men have lost their reasons. Men have lost their reasons. So in that situation, that ancient crowd, they're like, men have lost their reasons. They're like so brainless. So if Mark Antony says that Julius Caesar is not ambitious, then people would be like, oh, Julius Caesar is not ambitious. But if Brutus says that Julius Caesar is ambitious, then people are like, oh, Julius Caesar is ambitious. Here it's the same. Chief priest said that there is something wrong with Jesus. He's claiming himself to be God. Then we should crucify him. The crowd is like, crucify him, crucify him. They're just voice that echo someone else's decision. Okay, so that is the nature of the crowd. And we also see that though this crowd is very much vulnerable and very much slandering in nature, this person called Pilate, the governor, is more vulnerable than the crowd. Because what we see here is, this person wanted to please the crowd. See, the crowd is already so vulnerable. But then this person, this governor, wanted to please the crowd. We all know what is the function of the governor, right? What does that word mean? The word governor. The word governor means someone who governs, right? Someone who governs the people. But then what do we see here? We see that the people who should be governed by the governor is governing the governor here, right? In verse 15, it says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. So this person, this governor, wanted to satisfy the crowd, as well as in the other gospel account we see that this governor did not want to be the emperor, the enemy of the emperor. So this person is so much self-seeking, so much like pleasing men. He wanted to please the king. He wanted to please the crowd. You got it, right? So much self-seeking. And due to his self-seeking act, he is condemning Jesus to be crucified. And the next character, we saw the Barabbas as a character, and we saw the nature of the crowd. And the next character that we would be looking is the high priest. The high priest is the one who is controlling the scene here. He's a prime mover here. He is the one who acts behind people's back, behind the scene. We say there, the person is acting behind the scene. Literally, this person is acting behind the scene. He's going there and converting the crowd against Jesus. What is the role of a high priest? The role, like, why is the institution of high priest established in the first place? Why is the office of high priest established in the first place? In the Old Testament, we see that in the Day of Atonement, the one day in the year, the high priest goes to the Holy of the Holiest place and he makes sacrifice for himself, for his own sin, and for the sin of the humanity, right? And for the sin of the entire Israelite. However, what we see here is Jesus is making the sacrifice. Jesus, though being sinless, is making the atoning sacrifice for the sin of the entire humanity. But what the high priest is doing here is, the high priest is plotting against the true high priest. So Jesus is not only presented as a king here, Jesus is presented as the true high priest here, because it is the duty, the office of the high priest to make sacrifice for the sins of the people. However, what we see here is Jesus is replacing the old high priest by being the truest of the true high priest. He is making the sacrifice. He is sacrificing his own life for the people. The high priest in the Old Testament are with sin, were with sin. But then here we see Jesus, though he without sin, he is sacrificing himself as an atonement, as an atoning sacrifice. So, it's very ironic here that the chief priest, the high priest, is plotting to kill the true high priest. So it's very ironic to see that people may have certain roles, but then if we are not doing what we are commissioned to do, then that is a very sinful thing, right? Yeah. And Jesus. So all these people are involved in the criminal act of executing Jesus. It is not only the high priest. The high priest is involved. The entire Sanhedrin is involved. The Pilate is involved, and the crowd are also involved. The only character who is without sin is Jesus. And we see that, like in Pilate's case, we see, right, Pilate is being governed by the king. So Pilate considered himself as the Roman governor, and these Jews as those who are under Roman control. So for Pilate and for the Romans, the Jews are always under their control, right? They're not free men. Jews are not free men at all, because the Romans are ruling over the Jews. But then what we see is Pilate is acting according to the will of the Jews, the will of the crowd. So we see nobody is free here. Some or the other person is ruled by something or the other. What rules chief priest is jealousy. What rules the crowd is chief priest. What rules Pilate is the crowd. And we see the only free person here is the prisoner. Who is the prisoner? Jesus. Jesus is supposed to be the prisoner. Jesus is supposed to be not free. But then the only free person is Jesus. All the others are under some control. In verse 15, we see, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate releases Barabbas, and he had Jesus flogged and handed him to be crucified. In one brief word, Mark is just stating the entire thing. He had Jesus flogged. Like, we could just run through this, right? We could just read this passage, read this word in a split of second and go to verse 16. But then verse 15, he had Jesus flogged. That contained a lot of weightage. Maybe Mark is not narrating the trauma or the physical suffering of Jesus. Well, he's not giving a brief account of the physical torture of Jesus. But then flogging is the most cruelest or the merciless act that is done before crucifixion. And Josephus writes that the person who is flogged, he is being tied to a post, and he's been stripped, and then he is being beaten with leather whips woven with bits of bones and metal. And after flogging, the bowels the flesh and often the bones of the person is being exposed. So all this cruel act is just been mentioned in just one word. He had been flogged. That's it. Maybe because I believe that although Jesus is undergoing this much agonizing, traumatized, and hurtful scenario, Mark wanted to emphasize more on the mockery of Jesus, more on the mockery of the identity of Jesus than the physical torture. So you should have this scene in your mind. Pilate left Jesus to be flogged. And after flogging, you should just picturize how Jesus would be. According to the Roman custom of flogging, how Jesus would be. And after that, what we see, I will just share this thing. We'll go to the other passage. The soldiers act. So the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, they lead Jesus to the palace courtyard. There they remove Jesus' clothes and clothed him with a purple cloak and called him the King of Jews and paid homage to the king, stripped Jesus of the cloak and lead him out. So here also we see a structure here. They let him into the palace, A, and A-20B, what we see, they let him out. And B, what you see, they clothe him with purple cloak, and B-20A, what you see is they remove Jesus' cloak. And 18, what you see is Hail King of Jews, they are singing like that. And you also see what they do to the king. They paid homage to the king. So I just wanted to show these structures. So this would help us in while we are meditating or reading the Bible. So the entire episode, as I mentioned, the flogging part, though it is very much traumatized, and Mark just mentioned that in one word. And then he dedicates almost 6 verses to show the humiliation of Jesus. So Jesus is the king, right? And Jesus is being led to the palace. That is also very much ironic here. They are just trying to mock Jesus, because by mocking Jesus, the soldiers are also mocking the entire Jewish community. There is always this hatred towards the Jews. The Jews are the slaves, and here is someone claiming to be the king. So who is he? The slave king. You got it? So they are like, oh, if you claim to be king, then let me lead you to the palace. And the account says that this is a very beautiful palace. So they lead Jesus to the palace, and we should consider the condition of Jesus after being flogged. How would Jesus be? And then these people are leading Jesus into the palace. 16, and then they are gathering together, and then they are like removing Jesus's clothes and making Jesus wear a purple robe, like adoring Jesus like a king. So these are all kind of things, like purple robe and all these kind of things are something that is used to do for the Jewish gods. Sorry, the Roman gods. So Jesus is being worn a purple robe, and then the crowd says, "Hail, King of Jews! Hail, King of Jews!" They are claiming, though they are saying "Hail, King of Jews," it is like a parody. Like there is actually a hail statement for the King of the Rome. They all say "Hail, King of Rome." Okay, and the parody of it is "Hail, King of Jews." So in our culture also, we know that if something great is there, some really good music or song is there, then people are always so much people are inclined to make a parody for that song, just like a mockery on the song, right? Parodies are not a parody is a mark of a humiliation. So even though they are saying "Hail, King of Jews," they are not praising Jesus, rather they are humiliating Jesus. However, the bitter irony here is, even if they are humiliating Jesus, what they say is true. Jesus is the king. And in Pilate's account also, even if Pilate says, "Are you the King of Jews?" And then he says, "They call whom whom you call as a King of Jews. So all these are the intention is very much not good. But then he is confessing that Jesus is the King. In reality, Jesus is the King. And yeah, so they are making they're falling on their knees. Falling on their knees is like a prostrate of worship, right? And then there's but then here also their intention is not good. This is just mockery on Jesus. But then the irony here is Jesus is worthy of worship. Every knee shall bow before him. Every tongue shall confess that Jesus is the Lord. However, even if it is on an ironic sense, what they are doing is something that Jesus ought to receive. Jesus is the King. Jesus is worthy of worship. Every knee shall bow before him. So Mark is making the irony here, and it's also a mark of humiliation. And then they are removing this this thing and a cloak and laid him out to be crucified. So they handed. We see what we see here is in the earlier version, earlier chapter 10 verses 33 to 34. We see the passion prediction of Jesus, right? I'll read the verse. We are going to Jerusalem. Jesus is saying, verse 33, 10:33. We are going to Jerusalem. He said, the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priest. We saw that the Son of Man delivered to the chief priest, fulfillment of the passion prediction, and the teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin. They will condemn him to death. Pilate condemned Jesus into death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles. What is that? To the Roman soldiers. Jesus is being handed over to the Roman soldiers, and they will mock him, spit him, flog him, and kill him. Okay, so we see that all the passion predictions of Jesus is being fulfilled. Jesus was handed over, he was mocked, he was the Roman soldiers spit him and flog him. Okay. So as I stated, Mark's emphasis is more on the humiliation of Jesus rather than the physical suffering of Jesus. The physical suffering of Jesus is also there. So all this contributes to Mark's theme that Jesus is the suffering servant king, the suffering servant who remained silent in face of trivial accusations, the suffering servant king who remained silent when his identity is being questioned. Right? See, after reading this passage, I would synthesize it like this. The silence of Jesus in face of strong hatred, accusation, violence, and that is being revealed throughout, right? Because Jesus had all chances to prove his case. Jesus had all chance to prove his identity. In our case also, when we reflect upon our life, in many a times, we may be doing everything right, but then when we are accused, falsely accused, how is our stand? We always have the tendency to prove our case right, to reveal our identity, right? To reveal our true identity. But then Jesus is not doing it. The others are saying that Jesus is the king, right? But then Jesus is just remaining silent here. So it is Jesus reveals himself as the king. Mark presents Jesus as the king, and the king remains silent. So how is our response? How is our mentality? What are we taking from Mark's passage? Are we able to remain silent when we are being accused? That is something that we need to ponder upon. And we also see the self-interest of people. We see the self-interest of chief priest. In verse 9, what we say is, verse 10, what we say is, Pilate is asking these people, no, verse 9 onwards I'll read. Do you want me to release to you the King of Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it out of self-interest that chief priest handed him over to him. So the self-interest of the chief priest is revealed here. And the self-interest of Pilate is same here. Pilate wanted to please the crowd. Pilate wanted to please the emperor. So how is our self-interest determining in the crucifixion of Jesus, determining in we being disobedient to God? Our self-interest often leads us to be disobedient to God, right? We break the laws of God. We break the commandments of God because of our self-interest. And Mark identifies Jesus as a suffering servant king. And one thing that has really been the implicit message of this thing is, where is Jesus's kingdom? Jesus's kingdom is not of this world, right? All throughout the gospel, Jesus says that my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. So that is like a major message of the synoptic gospel. The kingdom of God is the major theme of the synoptics. However, in the final stage, Jesus is accused as being a king, right? As someone who wanted to establish a kingdom here. So it is like a direct contradiction to Jesus' message. Of course, Jesus is the king, but Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. It is like throughout Jesus preached a message that my kingdom is not of this world. But then the secondary characters throughout the gospel misunderstood Jesus. The disciples always thought that Jesus would establish a kingdom, and the crowd always thought that Jesus would establish a kingdom. And in John, we see that that in John 6 that we see that the crowd searched for Jesus because Jesus provided them with bread. So they walked miles and searched for Jesus and asked him to be their king. And knowing their intention, Jesus is saying that I am not a king who always gives you bread, but I am the bread of life. So Jesus is not a supplier king. Jesus is not just a provider king, but Jesus is the king. Jesus is the ruler king. See, in this account, we see that all the secondary characters, the primary character is Jesus. All the secondary characters are the ones who do not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. The chief priest does not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. The crowd does not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. Pilate does not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. Obviously, Barabbas, the criminal, does not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. The Roman soldiers does not want to be under the kingship of Jesus. So the king is dying. The king is being sentenced to death, but the king is without any, what gives rise to king? There will be only kings when there are people, when there are king's subjects, right? So in this entire pericope, we see that there is no subjects for this king, right? There is no subjects for this king. The king exists only when there are subjects. Who makes a king? The subjects make a king. But then here, there is no subjects. And they are just falsely accusing that Jesus claims to be the king. However, Jesus is the king. But the contrast is that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. And the silence is also a major theme here. We see that in verse, I'm going back to this thing because I was portraying the characters earlier, but then when I go to the themes, I might just jump back to the earlier verses. So in verse 2, Pilate asked, "Are you the king?" And then Jesus replied, "You have said so." Then verse 4, Pilate again asked, "Are you the king? Aren't you going to answer?" Jesus just remained silent, right? And the silence is also the response of Jesus. Sometimes, most of the time, we infer that only when we speak words out that we are responding. But that's not the case always. Non-verbal responses are there. It's a non-verbal response of Jesus. The silence is also a response of Jesus. And Pilate and Mark says that it amazed the crowd. It amazed Pilate. Jesus' non-verbal response, the silence, amazed Pilate because Jesus was not trying to defend himself. Right? Okay. I'm just moving forward. So the entire thing leads to the crucifixion of Jesus, right? The entire thing leads to the cross of Jesus. So all these things, all this theme of silence, all this theme of the self-interest of the people versus the obedience of Jesus. What is the obedience of Jesus demanded him? The obedience of Jesus demanded Jesus to give his life for others. So in one hand, we see the disobedience of the people as well as the self-interest of the people. On the other hand, we see the obedience of the Son of the Father's Son, which demanded him to give his life away for others. So self-interest and interest of the others, or self-interest, seeking self and seeking others, is also brought out here. Jesus died as an atonement for our sins, right? And so we are disobeying Jesus. Are we also disobeying Jesus out of our self-interest? That is a question that I wanted to ask. Are our disobedience are we disobeying Jesus out of our self-interest, or how are our responses when we are falsely accused? In Matthew 5, we see that blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of people against you. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for they have persecuted the prophets who were before you. So our silence or our response in front of when we are being accused or when we are being falsely accused is something that we need to consider. And all these things contribute to the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus, right? We often pray, keep us in the shadow of the cross, or cover us with your cross. We pray all these things, right? So whenever we pray these things, we need to remember that when we make such prayers, like cover me the shadow of the cross, or keep in the shadow of the cross. Cross signifies humiliation. Cross signifies denial of our rights. Cross signifies denial of our self-interest. Cross signifies suffering, and cross signifies obedience to God. So all these things we need to consider when we make such prayers. And Jesus is the King. So how do we identify with this King? He is not a king who grants all of us the life of princes and prince. That is what we see. We are the king's children. We are the king's daughters. We are the king's son. So we ought to live like princes and prince. But then what we see here is Jesus is the suffering servant king. The suffering of Jesus is being Mark identifies the suffering of the king. So how are we identifying ourselves with the king? We identify ourselves with the king by identifying with the suffering of this king. We are not seeking after the privileges, but then when we say that we follow this king, then we are saying that we follow the suffering of this king as well. So that is something very differentiating here. So what we see here is the differentiating thing of the kingdom of heaven, or the understanding of king for these people, and what the real kingship of Jesus means. And we have also seen how people misunderstood Jesus, and the self-seeking self-interest of the people. And see, Mark presents Jesus as a king. That's what my primary thesis statement was. And it is like Mark is covering Jesus. See, the entire gospel, when we read all these things, whom are we seeing? Are we seeing Jesus here, or are we seeing Mark here? Nobody identifies Mark, right? Throughout, if we read from Mark 1 to 16, and in any of the Gospels, whenever we read a Gospel, we are not recognizing the Gospel writer, but we are recognizing Jesus, right? Throughout the Gospel. When we read from 1 to 16, 1 to 20 of this passage, we realize, we understand Jesus here. We understand Jesus is suffering here. We are not understanding Mark here. We are not understanding anything about Mark here. We don't know anything about Mark actually. It is like Mark is covering Jesus with his writing. And it is always important that whenever we read Bible, we are taking Jesus and we are just leaving the gospel writer. It's like when we take a banana, we are eating the banana and we are just peeling off the skin of the banana. It's like that. Whenever we read gospel, we are taking Jesus in, and we hardly we consider usually people does a background study of the authorship and all, but then whenever we do it on our personal by meditation and all, we take the thing, right, not the writer. So whenever we hear a message or whenever we listen to any of the study, it is very much important that we take Jesus in. We take what Jesus wants to communicate to us through this verses in. We see the trial of Jesus and we see the response of Jesus, how Jesus faced the trial. Jesus's silence or Jesus's quality that is being revealed when Jesus was being trialed. That is a thing that we should take in. So this is an overview of the passage. So I would like to conclude here, and I hope all of you understood and would be able to, whenever we read it, we'll be able to know it more. So thank you, and I would hand it over to Jasmine.